Hey guys, it's Chloe. Welcome back or welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about one of my favorite topics here on my channel, suspension, and specifically from a consumer standpoint, the various or different ways you can lift your Toyota Tacoma. And I say from a consumer standpoint because I want to make it clear and I want to make a disclaimer that I am not an expert by any means at all. I am not a mechanic. I don't work for Toyota or anything like that. I am just your average third-gen Toyota Tacoma owner, enthusiast if you will. And I've done a couple lifts in a couple different ways on the Toyota Tacoma, and I really just want to share my experience and everything I learned with you guys today. So you can definitely take this information with a grain of salt if you want. If you're looking to lift your Toyota Tacoma and don't really know what direction to head in, definitely talk to an expert. Okay, also I'm only going to be talking about lifting the front of the Toyota Tacoma. A lot of you guys who have watched my channel before know that I don't do any crazy builds or anything extreme. All of my Toyota Tacoma projects have been pretty much like a beefed up version of the stock form of the Toyota Tacoma, if that makes any sense. So basically both of the trucks that you're going to see have just level lifts on them. The Toyota Tacoma from the factory comes lower in the front than it does in the rear, which means to level it out, I just basically do a minimal lift on the front. So that's why I'm only going to be talking about lifting the front today, because that's really what I have experience with. Now, of course, there are many different ways to lift a truck, but with the third generation Toyota Tacoma, I've only done like two kinds of lifts, so those are the two I'm going to be talking about today. So I've got two different Tacomas to show you in today's video. Both are lifted, but each have their own lift. One has a Westcott Designs lift kit, which is basically a lower shock collar that you replace on your OEM factory shocks. The other has a completely new set of shocks to give it lift. It has the Fox 2.5 Performance Elite Series coilovers. I'm going to be going over both today, comparing and contrasting. I did install both of these lift kits myself, so I'll talk about the difficulty, of course. And of course, ride quality matters a lot to me, so I'll be talking about that with these two different types of lifts. I figured it wasn't a bad idea to take the wheel and tire off so that we can get a better look at these lift kits. Let's start out with the Westcott Designs lift kit, which, like I said earlier, consists of this preload collar that is a little bit bigger than the factory shock collar that comes on this OEM shock, and it basically compresses the spring up, giving your truck a little bit more lift. Now, before I continue, right after I made the install video here on my channel about the Westcott lift kit, and just in general in all of my suspension videos, I get a lot of comments from you guys asking why I have never done a spacer lift or how this lift is different than a spacer lift. For those of you who don't know, a spacer lift is basically a shim or a piece of metal that you can put on top of your entire shock assembly that will actually push the entire shock down. That, of course, compresses the spring, and that's what gives you your lift. Now, unlike this Westcott kit over here, a spacer lift moves the entire strut assembly down. As you can see, the Westcott collar just pushes the spring up, not the actual strut itself. So with the spacer lift, now that your entire shock assembly is lower, yeah, you're going to get lift that way, but when the lower control arm comes up, you're going to bottom out sooner. Now, why is this bad? Well, where your factory bump stops are, they are not going to help you as much when you bottom out sooner, and this can put a lot of stress on the shock, especially if you're going off-road and hitting those bumps really hard, and that can cause your shocks to break more easily. With that being said, most people are probably not going to experience that with a spacer lift, so I'm not saying don't do it, but with the conditions I put my truck under, I personally don't think a spacer lift is safe, and that's why I'm sort of anti-spacer lift, and you guys have never seen me do them on my Tacoma. Okay, now back to the Westcott lift. How is the ride quality? Well, because this collar pushes up or puts preload on the spring, your ride's going to be a little bit stiffer, but because it's by a minimal amount, it's not gonna feel too different than your current ride. I find that the factory ride is a little too soft, and I actually like a little bit of a stiffer ride because it's more responsive. The handling is better with a stiffer ride, and you're not gonna get as much nosedive when you come to a stop. With this Westcott lift, you're not losing suspension travel because again, you're just putting preload on the spring, and albeit a minimal amount. And overall, I really like the Westcott lift because if you get a TRD Pro that comes with these OEM Fox shocks, they're pretty good straight out of the box. So overall, it's pretty cool that you can keep most of your factory components and at the same time get that lift you want to, say, run 285s. Now, what are some downsides to this Westcott lift kit besides the fact that we already talked about you get a slightly stiffer ride? Well, I will tell you the number one thing is that if you're a DIYer like me, the install of this kit is a little challenging. You've got to take the coilover off of the truck, and the hard part is you kind of have to disassemble it. It gets tricky because you have to use a spring compressor, which in and of themselves are really dangerous, and you have to be really careful when you use them. You've got to take the old lower shock collar off, which I found to be a little bit tricky, put the new one on, and then use the spring compressor again to reinstall the factory spring. So I think that's one of the most challenging things with the Westcott lift kit, but overall, I think the main selling point is, again, you get to keep your OEM parts, which already are pretty good. Besides getting a piece like the Westcott Designs preload collar that you can fit on your OEM shocks to give your truck lift, the other way I've lifted my Toyota Tacoma is by getting a set of aftermarket coilovers, specifically ride height adjustable ones. And before you say anything, yes, Fox also manufactures the OEM TRD Pro shocks that we just saw, but the aftermarket shocks that I use to get a lift on my truck here are the 2.5 Performance Elite Series shocks. They have their own design, and just by visual inspection, they are a very different shock. Aftermarket shocks like these ones typically have a combination of a stiffer spring and a preload collar, which is what this black ring is over here. Now, if you can see, there are threads on the shock body, so you can actually turn this with a spanner wrench. If you push it downward, you're obviously putting more compression on the spring, and that's going to give you more of a lift. And the opposite way is obviously going to decrease your ride height. Obviously, this is a much more expensive option compared to the Westcott lift. It's a whole new shock assembly. If you buy these new, you're getting new components, new seals, new everything. And unrelated to the ride height adjustments you can get with these kind of shocks, you can also get these with a ton of other features. I have remote reservoirs all around for better cooling. With Fox, you can also get DSC or dual speed compression to make different adjustments to the compression depending on what kind of terrain you're going on. But keeping on the topic of today's video, this is an example of some aftermarket coilovers you can get that come in a lot of variations, but at the end of the day, ultimately have that preload collar to give you the desired amount of lift. So based on my experience, I'll talk about some of the pros and cons if you decide to lift your truck by going with this aftermarket coilover route. Well, in general, I'll say that these specific aftermarket shocks are better performing than these stock shocks. However, of course, there are a lot of different aftermarket options out there, so that might not be true for everything, but these are high performing, and I can tell that Fox put a lot of time to design a shock that is able to utilize the suspension travel and geometry designed by Toyota. Installing a new set of coilovers is relatively easy, at least compared to doing the whole Westcott lift. This install isn't bad at all, and I actually made a whole video about it where I did the DIY install, so if you want to see that, check out the link in the description. Now, some negatives with going with an aftermarket coilover is that they can get really expensive. Like, this suspension setup is not budget by any means. The aftermarket coilover market has a whole spectrum of prices, of course, but based on what I've seen out there, the coilovers with these adjustable collars typically fall on the higher end scale. Also, I just want to mention that if you're going this route with getting aftermarket coilovers, it can be really overwhelming just because there's so many different options out there. The hard thing with shopping for suspension with these trucks is you can't really try out a bunch and see what you like. You kind of just have to go on other people's words or your own past experience. That's why I like to make these videos for you guys, but at the same time, suspension can't really be explained, it has to be experienced. So yeah, for me, that was one of the downsides with going aftermarket, just a lot of different options. Now, I want to end on this. There's a big difference between getting a spacer lift, as I mentioned earlier, getting the Westcott lift, and getting a brand new set of aftermarket coilovers with the adjustable preload collar. So how do you know what's right for you? My 2 cents is that if you want the lift, but you also want better ride quality and a more durable shock, the TRD Pro OEM Fox shocks ride pretty well already. But if you want to go a little bit more custom, maybe a setup like these Fox Performance Elite Series isn't a bad option as well. On this truck, I started out with the OEM Bilstein shocks. Those shocks are pretty small, and I wanted something more durable, so it just made sense to go the aftermarket route because I wanted the lift too. So hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully that helps a little. So those are the 2 different ways that I've lifted the Toyota Tacoma, or really just lifted the front of the Toyota Tacoma before. Since you made it to the end of this video, I hope it's helped out. Again, if you have a different experience than I have, definitely leave a comment down below. But I think I'm gonna end this video here. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you want to connect more with me, you can follow me on my Instagram. It is at ChloeKuoTaco. I post more in real time on there. Other than that, hope you guys have a great day. Happy modding your Toyota Tacoma, and I hope I will see you in the next video. Bye guys.